Let's move to our final presentation for this panel anyway. Dr. Erik Fischer. He is the director of the Socio-Technical Integration Research Project, which coordinates a series of studies by embedded humanists and social scientists in laboratories across a dozen nations. He's also associate director for integration at the Center for Nanotechnology and Society at Arizona State University, and an assistant professor with a joint appointment in the School of Politics and Global Studies and the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. A founding editor of the Journal of Responsible Innovation, Dr. Fischer has also served as a guest editor for Science and Engineering Ethics and co-edited the inaugural volume of the Yearbook of Nanotechnology and Society. Welcome to you. It's good to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read remarks, but also I have slides.
Let's have you push your button here to...
Sorry. I'll be reading my remarks, but I also have slides to accompany them. I'm grateful for this opportunity to address the Commission. In my remarks this morning, I want to suggest that ethical deliberation and scientific creativity can be mutually informative and even synergistic. My talk derives from the NSF project called STIR, Socio-Technical Integration Research. After describing the project's methodology, I'll look at some of the typical outcomes, then offer reflections on conditions for effective socio-technical integration at the lab scale. STIR consists of a coordinated set of 30 studies, each one of which embeds a Ph.D. level humanist or social scientist into a research laboratory for 12 weeks to engage in a process of semi-structured collaborative inquiry. This inquiry across the cultures attempts to explicate and ideally address the socio-ethical context of scientific research as an integral part of that research, rather than as an add-on, a bureaucratic burden, or an act of compliance. Explicitly attending to the socio-ethical context of their research can, however, represent a formidable challenge for many practicing scientists who not only lack the training, but more often than not, are also disincentivized from engaging in ethical reflection while in the midst of their daily research activities. Lab researchers also, by and large, operate within a cultural paradigm that posits that it is not possible and certainly not desirable to try to integrate socioethical inquiry into science. Consequently, the STIR project empirically investigates the possibility and utility of collaboratively working towards this form of integration. In order to make sense of the process by which ongoing dialogue with an embedded humanist can affect change in scientific research, I developed a framework for midstream modulation, which I can explain offline, that consists of the following 3 stages. Number 1, in de facto modulation, socio-ethical dimensions are pervasive in scientific research, but are largely invisible to scientific practitioners. Stage 2, feeding back observations and descriptions of this context can render it more visible to practitioners and heighten their reflexive awareness. Stage 3, often this can lead scientific practitioners to engage in ethical deliberation and make voluntary changes in material research practices. The interdisciplinary dialogues are structured by a decision protocol that is meant to be minimally invasive. We treat the protocol as a generic model for laboratory decisions, using it to facilitate collaborative description of the research process as it unfolds. Once embedded into the research process, it helps to elucidate choice, expanding both the values and concerns that factor into research decisions, as well as the perceived technical options for responding to them. Now, initially, what happens? This process tends to produce a pattern of dissonance or paradigm misalignment or incongruence. For instance, participating scientists will make statements such as, "We don't make decisions," or "My research doesn't involve any ethics." There's a number of different ways in which this can play out. Such statements seemingly undermine the very premise of the study. However, rather than confronting or disagreeing with their interlocutors or attempting to educate them by formal acts of pedagogy or retreating, the embedded humanist simply proceeds with the protocol exercise of eliciting and feeding back descriptions of the research context. This can, days or weeks later, lead to a eureka moment, a reversal in which the participating scientist undoes the previous statement and now sees his or her research through a more social scientific or ethical lens, as in the statement, "I guess this really is a decision." I'd like to turn now to 5 brief examples. In one case, previously tacit environmental issues surfaced and emerged over time. This led to reflections and experimental changes, which in turn helped the researchers resurrect a promising but previously abandoned project. 18 months after the study's conclusion, a return to the lab revealed that the protocol was still being used and that the changes that arose from the conversations with the humanist had been central to a successful dissertation defense. In another case, researchers came to see that they held conflicting views of the role of science in society, and that these views effectively deflected their own ethical reflections. Also, after the philosopher completed his study, the lab group continued to debate an ethical issue he had sparked. This led the group as a whole to make a behavioral change in their collective safety practices. Learning can also be bidirectional. This political scientist, doctoral student, became an adept experimentalist and ended up helping a biomedical researcher in another lab improve his experimentation processes. More importantly, she also catalyzed a new form of public communication and patient engagement and outreach on the part of one of her labs. Interactions and dialogues can also flag ethical issues and dilemmas that cannot be resolved at the level of scientific teams, and that require more extended and systematic deliberation, for instance by ethical experts or members of the public. Finally, I want to emphasize the confluence of hands-on reflective practice and professional identity. Only one of the 5 PhD trained scientists who, when asked at the outset of this study, stated that integration was part of their work. However, the others stated that it was an add-on. 10 weeks later, after weekly meetings that led to numerous changes in research practice and communication, all 5 stated that integration of socioethical aspects was, quote, part of the job, unquote. This table displays preliminary results from a survey of the 30 studies and the surveys in the field as I speak. We anticipate 30 responses. It shows that studies that embedded the STIR protocol for a 12-week or shorter period of time produce relevant changes in both socioethical awareness and behavior. I would like to emphasize 3 things that this approach does. First, it builds and exercises ethical capacity by which practitioners identify, reflect on, and respond to ethical issues. Such capacity supports what the Commission has elsewhere termed prudent vigilance, both at the individual investigator level and, I believe, more collectively in the scientific enterprise. I believe it is also relevant to the Commission's interest in education and in the abilities of neuroscientists to engage in accurate and effective public communication. Second, it helps to bring to light material adjustments in the science. This is important from the standpoint of downstream implications, disruptive technological developments and path dependencies, and more generally the social shaping and governance of technology. Finally, it can identify ethical issues for broader analysis and deliberation. In closing, I would like to identify 4 conditions for effective collaboration-based integration. And by integration, I don't mean all forms of integration. I know the Commission is considering numerous forms. I'm speaking about lab-level, small group, socio-technical integration. Number 1, integration should be embedded. Any dialogues and exercises should take place alongside regular scientific research routines. This will take time. Well, it will not take time away from the research, and it will help scientists perceive that what they are already doing from a different lens. Finally, it will also allow for transformative insights and learning. Number 2, integration takes time. The process is organic and tacit and requires incubation. I'm concerned that institutionalization could fail if it were embodied in a potentially alienating form of moral authority. It makes more sense, I believe, to institute temporary visits or rotations that facilitate ongoing, productively disruptive dialogues and that serve as a dynamic bridge between the cultures. Integration also needs to be voluntary. I believe this is true because one cannot compel virtuous behavior. It must be chosen for its own sake or as a means to a valued end or interest. And as a corollary, I think it's important for moral responsibility not to be vested solely in a moral expert. I think it needs to be shared, and hence the moral capacity needs to be built and exercised throughout the scientific enterprise. Finally, framing matters. I would encourage the Commission in their recommendations to focus on building moral capacity rather than on applying moral expertise, to emphasize collaboration rather than compliance, and recognize that even though this type of approach can add value to science, that's not the reason to do it. Rather, added value is a spillover effect, which is important because it gives the lie to the myth that ethical inquiry is somehow anathema to science or will slow down R&D. Thank you.
Erik, thank you very, very much.